When most people hear the word Viking, they think of horned helmets, endless battles, and fearsome raiders crossing the seas. But the real story of the Vikings is far richer and more complex. They were farmers, traders, explorers, and skilled craftspeople who built a remarkable culture in the cold lands of Northern Europe. This series will take you through every part of their lives. In this first part, we set the scene by looking at who the Vikings were, where they lived, and what made their world unique. The term Viking does not describe a single tribe or nation. Instead, it refers to people from Scandinavian modern-day Norway, Sweden, and Denmark who lived between the late 8th century and the 11th century. These people shared similar languages, beliefs, and traditions, but they were not one unified empire. Each region had its own rulers, laws, and customs. The word Viking itself originally meant to go on an expedition or to raid, not the people themselves. Many Scandinavians never went raiding at all. They stayed home, farming and trading. Scandinavia was a land of deep fjords, dense forests, and harsh winters. Farming was difficult, so communities were small and spread out. This environment shaped the Viking spirit of self-reliance, hard work, and exploration, because farmland was limited. Young men often looked for opportunities, abroad sometimes as merchants, sometimes as warriors. This hunger for new lands and wealth drove them to sail far beyond their home coasts. The Viking Age began around the year 793 CE, marked by the raid on the monastery at Lindisfarne in England. Over the next 3 centuries, Viking ships traveled to Ireland, France, Spain, Italy, North Africa. They founded settlements in Iceland, Greenland, and parts of Britain, and built trading networks stretching across Europe and into Asia. But the Viking world was not only about ships and raids, it was also about communities. Most Vikings were farmers who raised cattle, sheep, and pigs, grew grains and vegetables, and crafted goods for trade. They lived in longhouses made of wood, turf, or stone, and organized their lives around family and local assemblies called things, where laws were made and disputes settled. Religion played a key role in daily life. The Vikings worshipped a pantheon of gods led by Odin, the god of wisdom and war, Thor, the god of thunder, and Freya, the goddess of love and fertility. Myths and stories about these deities guided their values and rituals. Feasts and sacrifices were held to honor the gods and seek their favor for voyages, harvests, and battles. This mix of farming, trading, and seafaring produced a society unlike any other in medieval Europe. The Vikings were feared for their attacks, but they were also respected for their craftsmanship, navigation, and adaptability. They left behind not just tales of conquest, but also towns, trade routes, and cultural influences that shaped the history of many countries. In the next part, we will explore the family life and social structure of the Vikings, what their homes were like, how families worked together, and the roles of men, women, and children in this remarkable society. Although Viking raids and voyages made the headlines of history, daily life at home was the foundation of their society. Family and community were at the heart of everything they did. Understanding how Viking families lived helps us see that they were not just warriors, but people building homes, raising children, and running farms. Most Vikings lived in small rural settlements. Their homes were called longhouses, rectangular buildings made of timber, turf, or stone. A longhouse was both living space and workspace. Families slept, cooked, stored tools, and sometimes even kept animals inside during the harsh winters. At the center of the longhouse was a fire pit for warmth and cooking. Smoke escaped through holes in the roof, making the air hazy but cozy. The family unit was large and extended. Grandparents, aunts, uncles, and servants could all live under one roof. This meant plenty of helping hands for chores, farming, and childcare. Marriage was a partnership that involved property and alliances. Husbands and wives worked side by side to manage land, animals, and trade. Unlike many medieval societies, Viking women had relatively strong rights. They could own property, inherit wealth, and run farms when their husbands were away. Some even took part in trade or voyages. Women managed the household, oversaw food production, and raised the children. Men farmed, hunted, crafted, or went on expeditions, but both genders shared many tasks when needed. Children were expected to contribute early. Boys helped herd animals, collect firewood, and learn farming or fighting skills. Girls learned weaving, cooking, and other crafts. Play was also a form of training games like wrestling, Wooden sword fights and ball games built strength and coordination. By their early teens, most children were working nearly as hard as adults. Viking society was not equal for everyone. There were three main classes: jarls, nobles, carls, free farmers, and craftsmen, and thrall slaves. Jarls owned large estates and led warriors. Carls made up the majority free men and women who farmed, traded, and crafted goods. Thralls were enslaved people captured in raids or born into servitude. They worked the hardest and had the fewest rights, but some could eventually earn freedom. Despite these differences, the Viking world had a strong sense of law and order. Disputes within families or between neighbors were settled at the local assembly called the Thing. Here, free men, and sometimes women, could voice concerns, settle debts, or seek justice. Decisions were based on tradition and community agreement rather than a king's command. Family life was also deeply tied to religion. Seasonal festivals celebrated the gods and marked key times of the year, like planting and harvest. Weddings, births, and funerals all involved rituals meant to honor ancestors and protect the family. In many ways, Viking family life was tough but supportive. Everyone had a role to play, from the smallest child to the oldest elder. This strong social structure gave the Vikings the stability they needed to explore, trade, and fight far from home. In the next part, we'll look closely at childhood and education, how Viking kids were raised to be strong, skilled, and ready for the challenges of their world. Life for a Viking child was very different from a modern childhood. There were no schools, no toys bought from shops, and very little free time. Yet Viking children were not unhappy. They grew up surrounded by family, stories, and traditions that prepared them for adult life from an early age. Viking families valued children highly. A new baby was welcomed with rituals to protect it from harm and to link it to the gods and ancestors. Naming was important often. Babies were named after grandparents or heroic relatives to carry on their spirit. Boys and girls alike were seen as a blessing because both were needed for the survival of the household. Childhood began with learning through observation. There were no classrooms in Viking villages, so parents and older siblings were the teachers. Children watched adults perform daily tasks: milking animals, mending nets, weaving cloth, or repairing boat sand slowly joined in. Learning happened by doing, not by reading from a book. Work and chores started early. By the age of 5 or 6, children fetched water, gathered firewood, and helped care for animals. Boys followed their fathers into the fields on fishing trips or into the forest to hunt small game. Girls worked alongside their mothers, learning to spin, weave, cook, and preserve food. This wasn't just housework, it was training in the skills that would keep a future household alive. Playtime still existed, but it often doubled as training. Viking children played with carved wooden animals, small boats, and simple dolls. They played ball games, raced, and wrestled. Boys practiced mock combat with wooden swords and shields. These games built strength, coordination, and courage. Girls practiced archery or knife skills too, especially in frontier areas where everyone needed to defend themselves. Religion and stories shaped a child's world just as much as chores. Around the fire at night, elders told sagas of gods, heroes, and ancestors. These stories weren't just entertainment, they taught values like bravery, loyalty, and cleverness. Children learned about Odin, Thor, and Freya, and the rituals that marked the seasons. Education also included practical survival knowledge. Children learned to read the weather, navigate rivers, and remember landmarks. Boys, who would later become sailors or traders, were trained to recognize constellations and currents. Girls learned about herbs, healing, and managing supplies for long winters. By their early teens, Viking children were no longer considered children at all. Boys might go on their first voyage, join their father in battle, or take part in trading expeditions. Girls might marry, run parts of the household, or accompany family on travels. Childhood was short, but it produced capable, confident young adults ready for the challenges of Viking life. In the next part, we'll explore farming and daily work, how the Vikings grew their food, managed their land, and kept their households running. Although Viking warriors and explorers get most of the attention, the majority of people in Scandinavia were not raiders at all. They were farmers, herders, fishers, and craftspeople. The hard work of ordinary men and women fed the society, supported the ships, and kept families alive through long winters. Viking farms were usually small, family-run units. The land in Scandinavia was rugged and rocky, with short growing seasons. Farmers had to be resourceful to make the most of it. They cleared fields, built fences, and rotated crops to keep the soil healthy. Barley, rye, and oats were the main grains they grew. These became bread, porridge, and beers, the staple foods of Viking life. They also planted vegetables like onions, leeks, and cabbages, and gathered wild berries, nuts, and herbs. Livestock was just as important as crops. Cows provided milk, butter, and cheese. Sheep gave wool for clothing. Pigs and goats supplied meat. Horses were valuable for transport and prestige, while chickens laid eggs. In winter, animals were kept close to the longhouse to protect them from the cold and to keep them from being stolen. Fishing and hunting filled out the diet. Coastal communities relied on herring, cod, and salmon. Inland farmers fished rivers and lakes. Men also hunted deer, elk, and wild boar. Furs from these animals became trade goods, as well as clothing. In summer, families dried fish and salted meat to store for the long, dark months ahead. Work was divided, but flexible. Men typically plowed fields and built structures, while women managed the household, preserved food, and made clothing. Yet everyone pitched in wherever needed. Children herded animals, gathered firewood, and learned the skills they would use as adults. Craftsmanship was part of daily work too. Farmers made their own tools, carved wooden utensils, and mended nets. Many specialized in a trade blacksmithing, weaving, boat building that brought extra income or goods to barter. Local markets and seasonal fairs let families exchange surplus grain, dairy, or crafts for items they couldn't produce themselves. Viking farms were not isolated. Neighbors helped each other during harvest, building projects, or emergencies. This sense of community kept people alive in difficult times. Religious festivals also marked the farming year, celebrating sowing, harvest, and the changing of the seasons with feasts and offerings to the gods. Life on a Viking farm was tough. Winters were long, and bad weather could ruin crops. Everyone worked from dawn until dusk during the busy months. Yet this lifestyle built resilience, independence, and skill qualities that would carry into Viking voyages abroad. In the next part, we'll dive into religion and beliefs, the Norse gods, rituals, and myths that gave meaning to everyday life. Religion shaped almost every part of Viking life. It was not a separate activity for Sundays or special days. It was woven into farming, sailing, fighting, and family events. The Vikings followed a rich belief system filled with gods, spirits, and powerful stories that explained the world around them. The Norse gods lived in a place called Asgard, connected to the human world of Midgard by the rainbow bridge Bifrost. At the head of the gods was Odin, the one-eyed god of wisdom, magic, and war. He sacrificed his own eye to gain knowledge and was often seen as the protector of rulers and warriors. Thor, his son, was the god of thunder and strength. People wore small hammer-shaped pendants to ask for his protection against storms and evil. Freya was the goddess of love, fertility, and beauty, while her brother Freya brought peace and good harvests. Unlike later religions with strict doctrines, Viking belief was flexible. People might honor several gods at once, depending on their needs. Farmers offered sacrifices to Frey for good crops. Warriors prayed to Odin before battle. Families called on Thor for protection from disease or famine. Offerings included food, animals, weapons, or crafted goods. Sometimes these were left at sacred groves, stones, or springs. Other times they were shared in great feasts. Vikings also believed in a world filled with spirits and creatures beyond the gods. Trolls, elves, dwarfs, and giants appeared in myths and were thought to influence daily life. Ancestors' spirits were honored at burial mounds or special sites near the home. People carried amulets or carved runes to invite luck and ward off harm. Religious festivals followed the rhythm of the seasons. In winter, people held Yule celebrations with fires, feasting, and gifts. In spring, they marked the start of planting with rituals for fertility and growth. These festivals strengthened community bonds and reassured people that the gods were on their side. The Vikings believed death was not the end, but a journey. Warriors hoped to be chosen for Valhalla, Odin's hall, where they would feast and fight until Ragnarok, the end of the world. Others went to different realms, like ruled by Freya or Hel, a quieter underworld for ordinary souls. Burial customs ranging from ship burials to cremations reflected these beliefs. Religion gave the Vikings a sense of order and courage. Whether they were planting crops, crossing the sea, or going into battle, they felt surrounded by divine forces. This spiritual worldview helped them face the dangers of their time with confidence and purpose. In the next part, we'll explore ships and navigation, how the Vikings built the vessels that carried them across seas and rivers, and made their far-reaching journeys possible. If farming was the heart of Viking life, ships were its wings. Without ships, there would have been no raids, no trade networks, and no far-off settlements. Viking ships were so well designed that they became symbols of the entire culture, fast, flexible, and able to reach almost anywhere. The Vikings built many kinds of ships, but the most famous was the longship. Longships were narrow, light, and had shallow hulls. This allowed them to travel not only on the open sea, but also far up rivers. A crew could row with oars when the wind was calm, or sail quickly when the wind was strong. The prow of a longship often had a carved dragon or serpent head to frighten enemies and protect the crew from evil spirits. Another common vessel was the nair, a broader cargo ship. Nairs carried goods, animals, and people on long journeys. Without these cargo ships, the Vikings could not have built settlements in Iceland, Greenland, or beyond. There were also smaller fishing and ferry boats used every day along coasts and fjords. Building a ship required skill and teamwork. Viking shipwrights used oak and other strong woods, splitting planks so they overlapped like fish scales, a technique called clinker construction. This made the hull both flexible and sturdy. Iron nails and woolen ropes held everything together. Sails were woven from wool and treated with animal fat to make them waterproof. Navigation was just as impressive as shipbuilding. The Vikings did not have compasses, but they were expert readers of nature. They watched the sun, stars, winds, and waves to steer their course. They learned the color of the sea in different depths, the behavior of seabirds, and the drift of floating wood to tell where land was near. Some used sunstones, special crystals, to locate the sun's position on cloudy days. Crews needed discipline and cooperation. Everyone had an assigned place to row or handle the sail. Food, water, and tools were carefully packed for long voyages. On rivers, ships could be dragged over land between waterways. At sea, they could cross hundreds of miles in a few days with favorable winds. These ships allowed the Vikings to travel far beyond Scandinavia. They raided monasteries in Britain, traded in the markets of the Middle East, and explored the coasts of North America centuries before Columbus. But they also connected Viking communities at home, bringing news, goods, and people between scattered settlements. In many ways, Viking ships were floating villages, part workplace, part war machine, part home. They carried not just warriors, but also farmers, merchants, women, and children, creating a mobile society on the water. In the next part, we'll look at trade and exploration. How the Vikings used these ships not only to raid, but also to build one of the most far-reaching trade networks of the medieval world. Viking ships were not only built for raiding, they were also built for traveling far and trading widely. Trade and exploration were just as important as warfare in Viking life. These activities brought wealth, new ideas, and new lands into the Norse world. From their homelands in Norway, Denmark, and Sweden, Vikings sailed to many places. They traveled west to the British Isles, Ireland, France, and Spain. They went east along the rivers of Russia to the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea. They even reached the great city of Constantinople, known to them as Miklagard, where they worked as traders, bodyguards, and soldiers for the Byzantine emperor. Some sailed all the way to the Middle East, buying silk, spices, and silver. The Vikings carried goods from home such as furs, iron, amber, and walrus ivory. In return, they bought or traded for silver coins, glassware, wine, cloth, and jewelry. Markets sprang up in key spots like Hiddeby in Denmark and Birka in Sweden. These trading towns were busy places where merchants from many lands met, shared news, and struck deals. People spoke many languages and used weighed silver or goods in exchange, instead of coins. Exploration went hand in hand with trade. The Vikings were skilled at finding new routes and new lands. They settled on the Faroe Islands, Iceland, and later Greenland. Around the year 1000, Leif Erikson and his crew sailed west from Greenland and reached a place they called Vinland, believed to be part of North America. They built small camps there and explored, though they did not stay long. Trade was not just about money. It also brought new ideas, technologies, and beliefs into the Norse world. Vikings adopted new styles of weapons, clothing, and art from the people they met. They learned about Christianity and other religions. Some even converted and brought back priests and builders to create churches in Scandinavia. Trading voyages could be dangerous. Pirates, storms, and rival groups were always a threat. But the rewards were high, and many Viking families grew rich from trading instead of raiding. Some men and women became full-time merchants, making journeys year after year. Others combined farming at home with seasonal voyages abroad. Exploration and trade turned the Viking world into a network that stretched across continents. It helped transform Scandinavia from isolated villages into a connected region with influence far beyond its borders. This adventurous spirit also shaped the stories and sagas that Vikings told about themselves as bold travelers and seekers of fortune. In the next part, we'll look at raiding and warfare, how Viking raids were planned, what weapons they used, and what life was like for warriors on campaign. When most people hear the word Viking, they picture warriors charging from ships with axes raised. Raiding and warfare were indeed a big part of Viking history, but they were not the whole story. For many Vikings, raiding was a seasonal activity rather than a full-time life. Yet these raids changed Europe and made the Vikings both feared and famous. At first, raiding was a way to get quick wealth. Early Scandinavian farms could be poor, and silver or good land was hard to find. Raiding offered a chance for young men to gain treasure, fame, and followers. Over time, raiding also became a political tool. Kings and chieftains used raids to reward loyal warriors, punish rivals, and expand their influence. Raids were carefully planned. Crews gathered supplies, weapons, and ships. They chose targets such as monasteries, ports, and towns that held wealth but had little defense. The shallow draft longships allowed the Vikings to sail up rivers and strike deep inland, where enemies were unprepared. Because they moved fast, they could attack, take what they wanted, and leave before local armies arrived. Viking warriors used weapons that were practical and deadly. The spear was the most common, good for both throwing and thrusting. Axes came in many sizes, from small hand axes to the large two-handed Dane axe. Swords were prized and often decorated, passed down from father to son. Bows and arrows gave support from a distance. For protection, warriors carried round wooden shields, simple helmets, and sometimes mail shirts, though full armor was rare. A raiding party was like a mobile community. Warriors rowed their own ships, cooked their own meals, and camped together. Raids could last weeks or months, with crews sailing from one target to another. They divided the loot at the end of the journey, with shares given to leaders, warriors, and shipowners. Raiding was dangerous, but also an opportunity for adventure and social rise. Over time, some Vikings stopped raiding and began settling in the lands they had attacked. They founded towns in England, Ireland, and France, marrying local people and mixing cultures. In this way, what started as sudden strikes turned into permanent communities. The reputation of Vikings as fierce warriors remained, but their skills as farmers, traders, and settlers also shaped the places they touched. Raiding and warfare were not just acts of violence, but also a means of survival and ambition in a harsh world. They gave young men a path to wealth and glory, helped leaders build power, and opened doors to new lands. Without their ships and their courage, the Vikings would not have spread so far or left such a deep mark on history. In the next part, we can explore law and justice in Viking society, how disputes were settled and rules were made. Life in Viking society was not a lawless free-for-all. Even though the Vikings are remembered as fierce warriors and bold explorers, they valued rules and order in their own communities. Law and justice helped hold their society together and gave people a way to solve disputes without constant bloodshed. Every free man had a duty to respect the laws and take part in keeping them. Most laws were not written down, but were remembered and spoken aloud at gatherings. These gatherings, called things, were held in open air at special sites. People from surrounding farms and villages would travel to the thing to hear disputes, make decisions, and approve new rules. The thing was more than a court. It was also a meeting place where news was shared, marriages arranged, and trade conducted. Everyone could attend, but only free men had the right to vote or speak in debates. Women and slaves could still be represented by male relatives. At the thing, there was an official called the law speaker. He had the job of memorizing the laws and reciting them so everyone could hear. This kept the rules consistent, even without books. A panel of respected men then listened to the cases and gave judgments. In serious cases, such as killings, the whole assembly could decide the punishment. Viking laws were based on compensation rather than prisons. If someone was injured or killed, the guilty person or his family had to pay a fine called werguld to the victim's family. The amount depended on the status of the person harmed. This payment helped prevent feuds and gave families a sense of justice. For smaller crimes, there could be fines in goods or animals. For very serious crimes, a person could be declared an outlaw. This meant they lost all legal protection, and anyone could harm them without punishment. Being outlawed was often a death sentence, because the person had no community to support them. Disputes over land, inheritance, or honor were also common. The thing gave people a public place to argue their cases and to witness agreements. Oaths sworn at the thing were considered binding and sacred. Breaking an oath could ruin a person's reputation and make them untrustworthy in future dealings. Law and justice were not just about punishment. They were also about maintaining balance and peace in a society where family ties and personal honor mattered deeply. People believed that a fair judgment helped keep the favor of the gods and the stability of the community. Even powerful chieftains were expected to obey the law, and ignoring the decisions of the thing could lead to rebellion. This system of local assemblies and compensation worked well for a scattered population. It allowed Vikings to settle disputes, plan joint ventures, and create alliances. It also shows that behind the image of raiders and fighters, there was a people who valued fairness, order, and community responsibility. Their legal traditions even influenced some modern systems in Northern Europe. In the next part, we can explore the role of women in Viking society, their rights, duties, and the surprising power many of them held. Women in Viking society had more freedom and responsibility than many of their counterparts in other parts of medieval Europe. Although men and women had different roles, Viking women were not hidden away or powerless. They played an active part in family life, trade, farming, and even exploration. Their status helped make Viking communities stable and successful. From childhood, girls learned the skills needed to run a household and farm. They spun and wove cloth, made food, cared for animals, and managed stores of grain and goods. These tasks were vital for survival in a harsh climate. When men were away raiding or trading, it was the women who kept the farms running. They managed workers, oversaw planting and harvest, and handled business deals. This gave them real authority within their communities. Marriage was an important institution, but Viking women had rights in this area too. They could own property, inherit land, and receive a dowry. If a marriage failed, a woman could divorce her husband by declaring it in front of witnesses, something almost unheard of in much of Europe at the time. Widows often took full control of estates and businesses, acting as heads of households. These rights gave women security and independence and helped ensure that families and farms did not collapse if the men were gone. Women also took part in trade. Some became merchants in their own right, selling textiles, jewelry, or food. Others accompanied their husbands on journeys, sometimes settling in new lands. Archaeological finds in places like Iceland, Greenland, and even the British Isles show that women were present in many Viking settlements, helping to build communities abroad just as they did at home. In religion and culture, women held respected positions. They were often responsible for family rituals and the telling of sagas. Some served as seeresses or priestesses, performing ceremonies and offering spiritual guidance. These women were believed to have special powers and were treated with both awe and caution. While most women did not fight, the sagas speak of shield maidens, women who trained and fought alongside men. Although historians debate how common this was, there is evidence of women buried with weapons, suggesting at least some were warriors. Whether fighters, farmers, or traders, Viking women were integral to the strength and expansion of their society. The roles and rights of women helped the Viking world thrive. By managing homes, lands, and businesses, they created a stable base for the adventurous activities of the men. By raising children with strong skills and values, they ensured the survival of their culture. Far from being silent figures, Viking women were central to their families and communities. In the next part, we can look at Viking art, runes, and storytelling, how they expressed their ideas, recorded their words, and passed down their history. Viking life was not just about farming, sailing, or fighting. It was also full of creativity and imagination. Art, writing, and storytelling were ways for the Vikings to express their beliefs, decorate their world, and pass down history to the next generation. These cultural traditions helped shape how we picture the Vikings today. Viking art was everywhere. It decorated ships, weapons, houses, jewelry, and everyday tools. Instead of paintings on canvas, the Vikings preferred carvings in wood, bone, stone, and metal. Patterns were full of twisting animals, dragons, and knot-like shapes that seemed to move. These designs were not only beautiful, but also carried meaning. A carved dragon head on a ship's prow was thought to scare away evil spirits. A brooch or arm ring decorated with animal shapes might offer protection or signal a person's status. The Vikings also used runes, their own form of writing. Runes were letters from an alphabet called the Futhark. Each rune had both a sound and a symbolic meaning. People carved runes into stones, wood, or metal to record names, mark graves, or dedicate gifts to the gods. Runes were not just for everyday writing. They were also seen as magical symbols that could bring luck, protection, or curses. Farmers might carve runes on tools, travelers on their ships, and lovers on gifts. In this way, writing blended with belief. Storytelling was another vital part of Viking culture. Long winter nights were filled with the reciting of sagas and poems. These stories told of gods, heroes, family feuds, and epic journeys. They explained the world, taught values, and entertained listeners. Poets known as skalds composed verses to praise kings and warriors, often in complex rhyme and rhythm. The best sagas and poems were remembered for generations and later written down in medieval Iceland, giving us much of what we know about the Vikings today. These artistic traditions were not separate from daily life. A decorated sword hilt, a rune-carved stick, or a story told by the fire all added beauty and meaning to ordinary days. They also helped hold the community together. Shared stories and symbols gave people a sense of identity, linking them to their ancestors and to each other. Even far from home, a Viking could see familiar carvings or hear a familiar tale and feel part of the same culture. Art, runes, and storytelling also show that the Vikings were not only warriors and traders, but also creators and thinkers. They left behind not just ruins of houses and ships, but also an artistic language of patterns, symbols, and words that still fascinates us. These creative practices gave their world color, mystery, and memory. In the next part, we can look at health and medicine in the Viking world, how they treated illness, injuries, and everyday survival in a tough environment. Life in the Viking Age was tough, and good health could not be taken for granted. People lived close to nature, worked hard, and faced risks from injury, disease, and hunger. Yet the Vikings developed practical ways to stay healthy and to treat illness when it appeared. Their approach to medicine combined common sense, herbal knowledge, and spiritual belief. Most Vikings lived on farms and performed heavy labor every day. This hard work kept them strong, but it also caused injuries. Cuts, broken bones, and burns were common. Simple first aid was done at home. Families cleaned wounds with water or alcohol, such as mead, bandaged them with clean cloth, and used herbs to reduce pain or infection. Honey, which has natural antibacterial qualities, was sometimes spread on wounds to help healing. Herbal medicine was an important part of Viking healthcare. People learned which plants could ease pain, calm fevers, or stop bleeding. Yarrow was used for cuts, willow bark for pain relief, and garlic for fighting sickness. These remedies were passed down from one generation to the next. Women often acted as healers within their households, and some became respected local experts. Diet also played a major role in health. Vikings ate a mix of meat, fish, grains, dairy, and vegetables. This provided a decent amount of nutrients for the time. Fermented foods, dried fish, and stored grains helped them survive winter. Clean water was not always available, so weak ale was commonly drunk with meals. People also relied on outdoor activity and fresh air as natural parts of daily life. Not all treatments were purely practical. The Vikings believed that illness could be caused by spirits, curses, or the displeasure of the gods. They sometimes used charms, amulets, or runes for protection or healing. A sick person might have a special ceremony performed, or an offering made to a deity. This blend of medicine and magic reflected their wider worldview, where the natural and the supernatural were closely linked. Despite their efforts, life expectancy was shorter than today. Children were especially vulnerable to disease, and even small injuries could become deadly without modern medicine. Yet, archaeological evidence shows that many Vikings survived into middle age and beyond, with bones showing signs of healed fractures and successful dental care. This suggests that their methods often worked well enough to keep them going in a demanding environment. Health and medicine in the Viking world were practical, communal, and rooted in both experience and belief. Families took care of each other, shared remedies, and sought help from skilled healers when needed. These practices helped them endure the challenges of their time and keep their communities strong. In the next part, we can look at Viking feasting and food, what they ate, how they celebrated, and why meals were such an important part of their culture. Food was at the center of Viking life. It was not just fuel for survival, but also a way to show hospitality, wealth, and community spirit. Daily meals kept families going through hard work, while big feasts marked special events, sealed alliances, and honored the gods. On an ordinary day, a Viking household ate simple but hearty meals. Breakfast might be bread or porridge made from barley or oats, sometimes with dried fruit or honey. Lunch was often leftovers from the night before. The main meal in the evening included meat, fish, or dairy, along with bread and vegetables. Families cooked over open hearths inside their homes, using iron pots and wooden utensils. Everyone, including children, helped prepare and serve food. The Vikings raised cattle, sheep, goats, and pigs, which provided meat, milk, cheese, and butter. They also hunted wild animals and birds and fished in rivers and seas. Fish, such as herring and salmon, were salted, smoked, or dried to last through the winter. Vegetables like onions, leeks, cabbage, and beans were grown in gardens. Wild berries, nuts, and herbs added flavor and nutrition. Bread was a staple, baked from barley, rye, or wheat where it was available. Drinks were just as important as food. Water was not always safe, so people often drank weak ale made at home. Mead, a sweet drink made from honey, was popular at celebrations. Wealthier households sometimes had imported wine or special spices to flavor their drinks. Sharing drinks at the table built bonds between guests and hosts. Feasts were the highlight of social life. They were held to celebrate harvests, victories, marriages, or religious festivals like Yule. A feast could last for days, with long tables filled with roasted meats, fresh bread, cheese, and ale. Guests sat, according to rank, with the most important people closest to the host. Skalds recited poems, musicians played instruments, and games or contests entertained the crowd. Gifts were often exchanged, and alliances strengthened. Feasting also had a sacred side. Offerings of food and drink were made to the gods before eating, asking for blessings on the community. Certain animals might be sacrificed with their meat shared among the guests. These rituals connected people to their beliefs and gave meaning to the celebration beyond just eating and drinking. Food and feasting show how the Vikings balanced hard work with enjoyment. Daily meals gave them the energy to farm, sail, or fight, while big gatherings reinforced social ties and cultural identity. Eating together was a way of showing trust, generosity, and respect. In the next part, we can look at death and the afterlife in Viking culture, how they buried their dead, and what they believed waited beyond this life. Death was a natural part of life for the Vikings, and their customs around it were shaped by both practicality and deep belief. People lived with danger every day, from disease to accidents to warfare, so thinking about death and preparing for it was common. Yet death was not seen as an end, but as a passage to another world. The Vikings believed there were several destinations for the soul after death. Warriors who died bravely in battle hoped to be chosen by Odin's Valkyries to go to Valhalla, a great hall where they would feast and train for the final battle at the end of the world. Others might go to the field ruled by the goddess Freya, which was also a place of honor. Those who died of old age or illness could go to Hell, a quiet underworld that was not a place of punishment, but simply another realm. These ideas gave comfort and meaning, especially for warriors who risked their lives. Burial customs varied by region and by status. Wealthy chieftains or important figures might be laid to rest in a ship burial. The body would be placed in a real ship, or a stone outline shaped like one, along with weapons, jewelry, tools, food, and even animals. These grave goods were meant to help the dead person in the next life. The ship might then be buried under a mound of earth or, in some cases, burned. Ordinary people were more often buried in simpler graves with fewer goods, but even the poorest were usually given some items and a respectful ceremony. Funerals were also social events. Family and community members gathered to mourn, give speeches, and sometimes hold feasts in honor of the dead. This helped keep memories alive and reaffirmed the bonds between the living. Death could also mean a change of property and leadership, so funerals were times when new arrangements were made and alliances renewed. There were also rituals and taboos surrounding death. Some believed that the spirit of the dead lingered and could either protect or harm the household. Burial mounds were treated with respect, and offerings might be left there long after the funeral. Stories of restless spirits appear in the sagas, showing that people felt the boundary between the living and the dead was thin. These practices show how the Vikings combined their practical needs with their spiritual beliefs. They took care to honor the dead, prepare them for the next world, and comfort the living. In doing so, they created a sense of continuity that tied families and communities together across generations. In the next and final part, we can look at the legacy of the Vikings, how their influence continued long after the Viking Age ended. The Viking Age ended more than 1,000 years ago, but its impact is still felt today. The raids and explorations slowed as Scandinavian kingdoms became Christian and formed stronger governments. But the ideas, skills, and communities built by the Vikings did not disappear. Instead, they blended into the cultures of Europe and left a lasting legacy. One of the clearest marks of the Vikings is on geography. Many towns and regions in England, Ireland, Scotland, and France still carry names of Norse origin. These names show where Vikings once settled, farmed, and built communities. In parts of northern England, old Viking laws and customs shaped local traditions long after the raids ended. In Normandy, the descendants of Viking settlers became the Normans, who would later conquer England in 1066. The Vikings also changed trade and travel. Their networks connected the North Sea and Baltic to the rivers of Russia, the Middle East, and even Central Asia. These routes helped spread goods, coins, and ideas across vast distances. As they settled, Vikings turned raiding ports into trading towns, which grew into important medieval cities. This mixing of cultures enriched Europe with new crafts, foods, and technologies. Language and storytelling were also influenced by the Vikings. Many everyday English words, like sky, knife, and window, come from Old Norse. Some of the greatest medieval sagas and poems were written in Iceland by descendants of Vikings, preserving their myths, history, and values. These writings inspired later generations and still shape how we imagine the Norse world today. The Vikings' skills in shipbuilding, navigation, and exploration also had long effects. Their methods of constructing strong but flexible vessels influenced medieval ship design. Their voyages to places like Iceland, Greenland, and North America showed that the Atlantic could be crossed long before Columbus. This spirit of exploration set an example for future European explorers. Their social structures and legal traditions also left traces. The system of local assemblies, or things, developed into some of the earliest forms of democratic decision-making in Northern Europe. This idea of gathering free people to debate and decide issues lived on in countries like Iceland, Norway, and beyond. Even the image of the Viking continues to inspire. While some myths, like horned helmets, are inventions of later centuries, the real achievements of the Vikings are just as impressive. They were farmers and traders as well as warriors, and their culture was rich with art, craft, and community. The legacy of the Vikings is not just one of conquest. It is a story of movement, connection, and exchange. They carried their skills, beliefs, and stories across seas and continents, leaving marks on the languages, laws, and lands of many peoples. In this way, the Viking Age never truly ended. Its influence is still woven into the modern world, from place names and words to ideas about freedom, travel, and adventure.